Emily Carter's hands trembled as she held the letter on the small, worn table in her apartment, the words printed in neat, professional font promising money she desperately needed. Bills stacked high on the counter, overdue notices crumpled in the trash, and her mother's medical expenses weighed heavily on her mind. She had been searching for a way out of the endless cycle of debt, sending resumes, attending interviews that led nowhere, and facing rejection after rejection. Then came this opportunity, an arrangement that sounded simple, respectable, and perfectly legal, companionship for a fixed period, a few months, with no physical demands, no deceit, just time spent together. Her stomach twisted with nerves and hesitation, but the reality of her bank account left her with no choice. She could almost hear the echo of her mother's voice reminding her that sometimes, survival meant making hard decisions, and the thought of finally paying off even a portion of her debts made her feel both relief and guilt at the same time. She read the details again, the terms laid out clearly, the hours, the expectations, the boundaries, and tried to convince herself that this was just a job like any other, only different. Emily sat back in her chair and stared at her reflection in the cafe window across the street, her own tired eyes staring back, and whispered to herself, "I really needed the money, so I agreed to it," feeling the weight of that choice settle into her chest like a stone. She imagined what the coming weeks would be like, living in someone else's world, sitting in quiet rooms, attending dinners, learning the rhythm of someone else's life, and for a brief moment, fear flickered across her mind, but she pushed it away. She told herself it was temporary. Just 3 months. She could do anything for 3 months, couldn't she? The apartment felt suddenly colder, emptier, and she wrapped her cardigan tighter around herself, thinking of the warmth she hoped to find in the stability the money would bring. There was a strange thrill in signing the agreement, a mix of fear, hope, and the bitter taste of necessity, and she pressed her lips together to stop the trembling. Deep down, she knew this decision would change her life in ways she could not yet imagine. As she packed the small bag she would take to her new temporary home, she felt a strange mixture of anticipation and dread. Outside, the world moved on, unaware of the quiet, trembling determination of a woman who had made a choice out of sheer survival. She left the apartment that evening feeling the last flicker of her old life slip behind her and walked toward a future both unknown and necessary, with only one thought repeating in her mind. She had agreed, because she had no other choice, and she would see it through, no matter how strange or unfamiliar it felt. Emily stepped into Daniel Wright's house for the first time, her nerves tangled with curiosity as she took in the quiet, polished space that felt both empty and alive at the same time. The living room overlooked the ocean, the waves catching the last light of the evening, and the house smelled faintly of old wood and a hint of lavender, calm and distant. Daniel, a tall man with kind but reserved eyes, greeted her with a polite smile, explaining once more the terms of their arrangement: dinners, occasional outings, quiet evenings together, nothing more. Emily listened carefully, her heart beating faster, trying to measure the difference between comfort and intrusion, between kindness and expectation, and she found herself noticing small details: an untouched second coffee mug, an old piano in the corner, family photos turned slightly away from view, books stacked but unopened. Over the following days, Emily settled into a rhythm she didn't expect, moving quietly around the house, helping with small chores, sharing meals and conversations that felt strangely personal despite the formal start. Daniel, careful and deliberate, shared bits of his life, stories of a childhood by the lake, a family lost to time, and the subtle loneliness that had settled into the corners of his home. Emily found herself listening not just with her ears but with her heart, noticing the way he stared at the ocean for long stretches, as if waiting for something she couldn't yet name. The evenings became a gentle pattern of small smiles, soft laughter, and quiet companionship, and Emily realized that while she had agreed to this arrangement for money, she was beginning to understand the depth of the man she was spending time with. She saw moments of vulnerability peek through his calm exterior, gestures that hinted at grief and longing he didn't voice, and she felt a surprising tug at her own heart. At the same time, she fought to maintain the mental boundaries she had promised herself. This was temporary, this was a job, and she could not let herself become more involved than necessary. But the house, the ocean, and Daniel's quiet presence created an unspoken connection, a fragile thread between them that neither dared to name yet. Emily caught herself anticipating the evenings, noticing the small, thoughtful ways Daniel tried to make her comfortable, and feeling the strange warmth of being wanted simply for who she was, even in a professional sense. The walls between them, once firm and clear, began to soften, and she discovered that her role was no longer just about fulfilling the contract. It was about understanding him, about learning the quiet ways in which he trusted her presence. She began to see that the money was secondary to the deeper human needs she was fulfilling, being seen, being heard, and being understood. Each day she stayed, Emily noticed more layers of Daniel, the careful way he moved around the house, the way he preserved memories in small corners, and how loneliness could be as visible as any object in the room. Her own life, with its worries and debts, began to feel both distant and intertwined with his, as if their separate troubles were quietly converging into a shared rhythm. Slowly, Emily realized that this arrangement, which had seemed purely transactional, was revealing a subtler truth about human connection. People sometimes hire comfort, but they receive more than they expected, and sometimes the people offering comfort find themselves changed in the process. By the end of the week, Emily understood that Daniel's need was not for conversation alone. It was for someone who could witness the quiet sorrow he had carried for years, someone who could be present without judgment. And as she left the house each night, the ocean stretching endlessly before her, she felt the tug of something that was no longer about money, a growing awareness that she was part of a story bigger than she had anticipated, and that in the quiet, deliberate presence she offered, she was beginning to touch the edges of a life she had never imagined for herself. As the days turned into weeks, Emily and Daniel's lives began to intertwine in ways neither of them had expected, each evening carrying a gentle rhythm that blurred the lines between arrangement and genuine companionship. They shared quiet dinners, sometimes laughing at small jokes, other times sitting in comfortable silence while the ocean whispered against the shore outside the window. Emily found herself learning the subtleties of Daniel's moods, the way he tapped his fingers when deep in thought, the faint smile that appeared when he recalled a happy memory, and the shadows in his eyes that hinted at loss. In turn, Daniel began asking about her life, her dreams, her fears, and she spoke freely, telling him stories she had once only whispered to herself. There were nights when their conversations drifted to tender memories of love lost and moments of longing, and Emily noticed the tension that grew quietly in the space between them, an unspoken connection that neither wanted to acknowledge but could not ignore. She told herself repeatedly that it was temporary, that she was here for the money, but her heart betrayed her with each passing day, quickening. When he smiled or looked at her in a way that seemed to see not just her presence but her essence. Daniel, equally careful, struggled with the same pull, aware that his loneliness had slowly transformed into something deeper, something that frightened him because it was no longer safe to feel so strongly. Their hands brushed accidentally at dinner, and Emily felt a shiver of warmth. A shared laugh stretched a second too long, leaving them both smiling awkwardly but not wanting to break the moment. Each evening became a careful dance of closeness and restraint, as though the house itself held its breath, sensing the delicate tension growing between them. One rainy night, as they sat by the window with hot tea, Daniel confessed in a low, hesitant voice that her presence no longer felt like a job or an arrangement. Emily's chest tightened, and for a moment, the world outside the window seemed to pause, the sound of rain matching the beat of her heart. She wanted to speak, to confess the feelings she had tried to suppress, but fear held her back, fear that revealing her heart would shatter the fragile peace they had built, fear that when the money ended, so would whatever fragile connection had begun to bloom. Yet, every glance, every touch, every quiet smile deepened the bond between them, making the temporary agreement feel meaningless in the face of real emotion. They found themselves seeking each other's company not out of obligation but because the silence of the house felt unbearable without the other's presence. Emily realized that she looked forward to the evenings more than she should, that the thought of leaving after 3 months filled her with unexpected sorrow, and that she had begun to measure time not by the hours of work but by the moments she spent near him. Daniel, meanwhile, struggled with the knowledge that he had let someone into his carefully controlled life and that the walls he had built around his heart were crumbling under the weight of unspoken desire and longing. Their conversations became more personal, more honest, and at times, Emily caught herself imagining a life beyond the agreement, where she could be more than just a companion, though the very thought scared her with its impossibility. They shared small, intimate moments, a hand on a shoulder, a lingering look, laughter at inside jokes, and the quiet comfort of mutual understanding, and each one left a mark that neither could ignore. The emotional tension built with every passing day, subtle but undeniable, a quiet crescendo that made both of them question what they truly wanted and what they were willing to risk for it. By the end of the third week, it was no longer clear whether they were bound by contract or by the fragile, growing love that had started to weave itself through their daily routines. Emily began to see Daniel not as a client or an arrangement but as a man full of depth, grief, and unspoken hope, while Daniel recognized in Emily a light he had almost forgotten existed, someone who made the house feel alive, warm, and full of possibility. The tension between them was no longer about the rules they had agreed upon but about the fear of admitting the truth, that they wanted more than they had planned for, that their hearts had crossed lines the contract could never define. One evening, Daniel looked at her across the dinner table, his voice soft and unsteady, and said, "You don't feel like an arrangement anymore," and Emily's breath caught, her heart racing with a mix of relief, fear, and longing. She knew then that the walls they had built were no longer strong enough to contain their feelings, that the quiet house, the ocean, and their shared time had done what neither expected. They had created a bond that neither money nor fear could erase. Yet, the shadow of the ending loomed over her, the knowledge that the agreement had a fixed term and that once it ended, she might have to walk away from someone who had come to mean more to her than she could admit. Despite this, they continued to share their evenings, laugh, and confide, savoring the moments that now carried an unspoken depth, every glance charged with emotion, every word heavy with the weight of what they both knew but could not yet fully face. Emily realized she had fallen in a way she had never planned, that the arrangement meant for survival had become something far more powerful, a quiet love that grew in the spaces between words, the pauses in conversation, and the gentle understanding that each of them needed the other in ways neither had expected. And as she sat by the window one night, watching the ocean stretch endlessly into darkness, she understood with a mixture of fear and hope that their lives had shifted forever, and that the story they were writing together was no longer about money, rules, or temporary arrangements, but about hearts quietly finding their way to each other in the most unexpected of places. Emily had grown used to the quiet rhythm of Daniel's home, the soft laughter, the shared meals, the subtle ways they understood each other without words, but the fragile comfort of their days was suddenly shattered when she overheard a phone call late one evening. She had gone to grab a glass of water when she caught the faint murmur of Daniel's voice, a mixture of tension and sorrow, speaking to someone she couldn't see. His words were careful, measured, but unmistakably final. He spoke of leaving, of stepping away from his life, his work, the house, everything he had built, and Emily felt her stomach tighten as the weight of his intentions hit her. This was not a temporary trip or a business decision, it was a permanent goodbye, a turning point she had never anticipated. She realized then that the money he had been paying her for companionship was never truly about financial exchange, it was about preparing for this moment, about filling the emptiness of his life with someone who could bear witness to the process of letting go. Her mind raced with confusion, betrayal, and fear as she listened to him describe his need for closure, a last chapter of connection before he withdrew completely from the world he had once inhabited. Emily felt a cold realization settle over her. She was not just a hired companion, she had become entangled in the deepest, most vulnerable part of his life, someone he trusted in ways he had trusted no one else. The days that followed were tense, filled with a delicate dance of pretense as Daniel continued his polite, calm behavior, unaware that Emily knew the truth. She observed him more closely than ever before, the way he moved through the house with quiet determination, the small gestures of farewell he didn't speak aloud, the way he looked at the ocean as if measuring time and space for a final act of release. Emily's heart ached with the knowledge that all the tender moments, the laughter, the shared stories, and the unspoken connection were part of a carefully orchestrated ending he had planned, and she struggled with anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of helplessness. Yet, amidst the pain, she recognized the depth of his honesty, the courage it took to face his past and accept that he could not continue in the life he had known. The realization hit her hard. Daniel's grief was not a temporary shadow but a permanent part of him, and he had reached out to her not only for comfort but for understanding, someone to help him transition through the final stages of letting go. Emily confronted her own feelings, questioning the nature of their connection, whether what she felt mattered if he intended to leave it all behind, and whether she could continue to stay in a life so poised for endings. She wrestled with the knowledge that she had allowed herself to care deeply for someone who had planned a future without her, and the emotional tension of that understanding left her restless and uncertain. Each shared meal, each evening by the ocean, now carried a different weight, a bittersweet mix of gratitude and fear, because she knew the end was approaching and that the bond they had built might dissolve the moment he left. Yet, in observing Daniel's preparations, Emily also saw glimpses of the man beneath the grief, the same man who had laughed softly at her jokes, listened intently to her stories, and allowed small, tender moments of connection. She realized that despite the impending departure, he had changed too. He had allowed himself to feel companionship, warmth, and even love in ways he had thought impossible after his loss. Emily began to understand that their time together, though contracted and temporary, had created real emotional impact, a subtle but undeniable shift in both their lives, and that the money had been only a surface layer over something far more human and profound. Her own heart ached with longing and fear, yet she could not deny the growing truth. She had become essential to him, not in the way the agreement had specified, but in the deepest, most human sense of the word. The revelation of his plans forced her to confront what she truly wanted, not the money, not the safety of boundaries, but the connection they had created, fragile as it was. She realized that leaving now would mean abandoning not only him but the quiet love and understanding that had blossomed in the in-between moments of shared lives. One evening, she approached Daniel, heart-pounding, and asked directly about his intentions, and for the first time, he spoke openly, admitting that he had planned to step away, to leave the house, the memories, and the routine behind. His confession was raw and honest, filled with sorrow, regret, and a quiet plea for understanding. Emily felt tears rise unbidden as she processed the truth. The man she had come to care for so deeply was about to erase the life they had shared, not out of malice but out of necessity. And in that moment, a painful clarity struck her. This was the twist she had not seen coming. The agreement, the money, the companionship, all had been a path leading to this point, a final act of vulnerability he had allowed her to witness. Yet, despite the heartbreak, Emily recognized the courage it took for him to face his own limitations and mortality, to seek closure without illusions, and she felt a mixture of respect, sorrow, and a fierce protective instinct rise within her. The emotional landscape between them shifted dramatically. What had been tension and quiet longing became urgent, fragile, and full of unspoken possibilities. Emily knew that she had a choice, to leave, as the contract might suggest, or to step forward and claim a role in his life not dictated by money but by shared understanding, compassion, and the delicate, emerging love between them. Each moment became charged with anticipation, the silence in the room, the way he moved through familiar spaces, even the sound of the waves outside the window, and Emily realized that their story was no longer simple, no longer transactional, but a complex, beautiful, and heartbreaking dance of human emotion, grief, and the unexpected depth of connection. The weeks they had spent together, filled with quiet companionship and subtle intimacy, now took on new meaning, revealing that sometimes, arrangements meant for necessity could evolve into something far more profound and life-changing. And as Emily looked at Daniel, standing by the window with the weight of his own decisions pressing on him, she understood with piercing clarity that she had become far more than a temporary presence in his life. She had become a witness to his truth, a participant in his healing, and perhaps, if she chose, the person who could help him find a way back to life and love,